to take the resentful path and shake his fist at God. And we have those spirits inside of us warring constantly. And so then when I look at a story like Cain and Abel, I think, well, the question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen? Because when you are dealing with fundamental realities and you pose
I just stop. Begs the question, what do you mean by happen? That's not what beg the question means. I always give this public service announcement. Learn what beg the question means. Beg the question doesn't mean raise the question. It raises the question, or there's a question that arises because of X, Y, Z. That's not what beg the question means. Beg the question means to use circular argumentation and to assume the thing that you want to prove, to assume the thing that you want to conclude. That's what begging the question means. It's a logical fallacy. It doesn't mean raise the question. So begging the question of what does happen mean, this is like really bad, really ignorant. And so he's a professor. I don't know why he's falling into this mistake, but please, guys, everyone listening to this, do not use beg the question to mean raises the question.
Yes. You have to understand that the reality of the concepts of your question, when you're digging that deep, are just as questionable as what you're questioning. So people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean, except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things mean. And so for me, belief, for example, is often reflected not so much in proposition as it is in action. If I want to know what you believe.
Okay, so this has become a meme at this point. As soon as like this interview was published or this discussion was published, people are memeing. Like, what do you mean by do? What do you mean by happening? What do you mean by you? So this is like you're a freshman in like philosophy 101 and you write these kinds of things. I mean, some students, like, because they think it's like profound. Like, what do you mean by you? And what do you mean by do? And what do you mean by what? And what do you mean by happening? This is really sophomoric, unfortunately. So, and I mean, the deeper point is this type of, it's sophistry. I highlighted a comment earlier in the stream that this is sophistry because you're just playing with fundamental language. And if you play, like you have that level of skepticism, then you really can't communicate. You had no problem with these words. Jordan Peterson had no problem with utilizing this language throughout the entire conversation to make the kinds of points that he wanted to make about higher unity, or we are sitting here and if we don't, have this conversation, we're going to go to hell, or stuff like that. He had no problem using language, unhesitatingly to talk about those kinds of things. But then as soon as it's the issue of, well, do you believe in God? Okay, now the language itself has to go. The language is suffering from this kind of doubt that we can't even be sure what these words mean. And this is actually a tool of liberalism and liberal academia, is that they deploy this type of hypercriticality, bordering on postmodernist, like Jacques Derrida type French critique, when they deploy that against religion, they deploy that against tradition, they deploy that against values, objective values, but they never deploy it against their values, the liberal values. They never raise this question about, oh, do you believe in human rights? Imagine people asking Muslims, do you believe in human rights? Oh, well, what do you mean by do? And what do you mean by you? And what do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by human? And what do you mean by rights? If you do that, they'll brand you as an extremist and a terrorist. Just answer the question, terrorist. Stop doing this taqiyya. We can't use that kind of hypercriticality when it comes to human rights. Or if, do you believe that all women should be educated and all women need to go to school? And do you condemn minor marriage? And do you condemn this, and that? Do you condemn slavery? Oh, well, what do you mean by slavery? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by condemn? No, in those cases, then there's no hypercriticality, hyper skepticism where we have to basically depart from language itself because it's just too difficult, too complicated to understand. No, in those cases, you better recite the liberal doctrines. You better recite by heart everything that liberals want you to believe and are telling you these are the highest truths. In those cases, then there's no room for skepticism or criticality or being academic, being scholarly and nuanced. And I experienced this kind of hypocrisy when I was in the university, when I was studying in my, doing my graduate studies and so forth. I would bring this up is like you're bringing a kind of hyper skepticism to deconstruct and undermine tradition and religion and these kinds of values. This is especially prominent in Islamic studies with these, bozos, basically, liberal Muslims and whatever that are trying to deconstruct Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, or deconstruct Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah, looking at Imam al-Shafi'i and deconstructing his fiqh and showing how his fiqh is just a product of culture and a product of power, and he's just constructing Islamic orthodoxy, like Shahab Ahmed would say, and he's constructing this kind of image of Islam that has no basis in, actual tradition or in let alone objective reality. And then you point out that, hey, well, why don't we bring this hypercriticality to some of these values that is either the subtext or explicit in your own scholarship or in your own activism, because you as an Islamic studies professor seem to be very in favor of women's rights and LGBT rights and trying to reform Islam to accommodate gay marriage and having female imams and creating this kind of religious unity. Don't takfir, don't have this idea of kufr, on and on and on. You're trying to liberalize the religion because you take those values as objective. And when I try to bring that criticality and that skepticism and I try to deconstruct these values, then, oh, that's not allowed. Daniel, why are you being so difficult? Why are you trying to disrupt the class? Why are you trying to sidetrack the discussion? We're not interested in that discussion. Stay on topic, stay on focus. Focus on the issue at hand, which is to undermine the Islamic tradition. This is a hypocrisy, and we see this in a nutshell with how Jordan Peterson responds to Muhammad Hijab's questions.